Are America's big tech companies too big? So much so that they violate antitrust laws. We will take a look at the U.S. Congressional inquiry that could force Silicon Valley giants to break up. Hello, I'm Mark Niu, and this is The Heat. Competition is the name of the game in the U.S. market economy. Well, in theory, there are laws to prevent companies from becoming so big that they form a monopoly. In the past, the federal government has acted to break up companies into smaller units, like they did with telecom giant AT&T in the 1980s, and they could do it again. 4 major tech companies are under scrutiny by the U.S. Congress. Mark Niu explains.
The most relevant.
Lawmakers grilled some of the most powerful tech CEOs: Google's Sundar Pichai, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, and Apple's Tim Cook.
Can you give us 2 assurances?
The hearing was called to investigate whether the business practices of these tech titans amounted to anti-competitive monopolies, though it appeared members of Congress had already made up their minds.
Many of the practices used by these companies have harmful economic effects. They discourage entrepreneurship, destroy jobs, hike costs, and degrade quality. Simply put, they have too much power.
I believe that Facebook and the U.S. tech industry are a force for innovation and empowering people. But I recognize that there are concerns about the size and power of tech companies.
A Democratic Party congressman also questioned Zuckerberg about whether his social media platform allowed users to promote racism and spread disinformation. Zuckerberg said Facebook was battling both of these problems and that it had built sophisticated artificial intelligence systems to help.
Conservatives are consumers too.
A Republican congressman also questioned Zuckerberg about why Facebook temporarily suspended the account of the president's son, Donald Trump Jr., for posting a video about face masks and the drug hydroxychloroquine. Zuckerberg pointed out it was actually Twitter that deemed the video false and made the suspension. But he said Facebook would also remove posts making false medical claims related to coronavirus because they could cause imminent risk of harm. President Trump himself has had posts flagged on Twitter and removed on Facebook, having been classified misinformation.
Because there's no question that what the big tech companies are doing is very bad.
Amazon's Jeff Bezos also faced a grilling over allegations his company used data from third-party sellers to launch competing products. And Google's Sundar Pichai also took some heat from the subcommittee chair when he was questioned whether Google searches sending people to websites was a conflict of interest when Google is promoting its own products and selling ads. Pichai responded that Google's like any other company, just using data to try and improve its products for users. Mark Niu, CGTN, Mountain View, California.
To talk more about the possible impact of those hearings, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Adonis Hoffman is the CEO of the Advisory Council. Robert Atkinson is the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He joins us from Washington, D.C. via Skype. Also via Skype from Larchmont, New York, Harry First is a professor of law at New York University, and correspondent Mark Niu joins us from Silicon Valley. Welcome to all of you. And Mark, let me start with you. These 4 companies that were called to Congress, they're huge companies, they're powerful companies, they have a market cap value combined of something equivalent to the GDP of Japan. So how significant was this hearing by the U.S. Congress to effectively bring these companies down to size?
That's right. It was very significant because in a time of pandemic, these companies are only getting stronger. While the rest of the economy is laying off workers, these companies are hiring and expanding. Think about Amazon, how dependent we are in making those orders from home while we're quarantined. Look, Jeff Bezos, now the richest man in the world, also the owner of the Washington Post, bringing up some potential conflicts of interest. Look at Apple. Their stock has gone up more than 200 points since the pandemic started. Apple, the most valuable company in the world. And with the election less than 3 months away, Facebook needs to be kept in check. At least that's the viewpoint of Congress, because in a hotly divisive election, they want to make sure that the pressure is on Facebook to keep out foreign interference, unlike what happened in the previous election. Now, and this could be a thing where they monitor Facebook as to cut down on hate speech and inciting violence in a time where protests are rampant. And also, it's a different scenario from years ago or maybe decades ago when these companies were all smaller companies, less powerful, and had that Silicon Valley ethos that move fast and break things. That was their sort of the way they worked. That regulation, don't worry about it, it will catch up with us later. By that time, we'll have so much power and market demand that it won't really matter. Well, Congress is now trying to catch up and take them on head on at this point before they get even bigger and more powerful. And this time, Congress did come well armed. They had more than 1.3 million documents, and they were well researched in some incriminating memos that really highlighted the fact that these companies were doing some unethical practices. Anand.
Harry, first, I presume it is not illegal for a company to grow. They can grow as big as they want to. But at what point does a company, like these 4 companies that we saw in Congress, at what point do they grow so big that they actually cross the line into getting the attention of Congress and being called to a hearing to answer for that?
Well, there are 2 different things between the attention of Congress and what can be done under the law. So under the antitrust laws, size in itself actually doesn't matter. What matters is having a monopoly position. So you can monopolize bubblegum and you can monopolize search. So size isn't the critical thing. And even monopoly is not the critical thing. The critical thing is conduct. So once you are a monopoly, the question is, what sort of conduct are you engaging in? Are you engaging in anti-competitive exclusionary conduct? So the kinds of things that we're just talking about now in terms of their size, political power, the importance in society, these are important in a sense in the background, but legally not really quite so important. The documents that Congress has, they're important.
So, Harry, has it been shown that these companies have engaged in practices which would, I guess, constitute a violation of law?
Well, that's to be seen yet, because at the present time, both the federal government and the states are investigating these companies, and we are told in press reports that suits are soon to come, particularly against Facebook. So it may be that there are aspects that are in violation of U.S. antitrust law. But I would stress that current law is fairly conservative in this sense, gives even monopoly firms a lot of space to compete, maybe more than they should have. And that's really the reason for these hearings, is to see whether we need new legislation that would do something more than what we can do under current law.
Robert Atkinson, what is your view on this? I mean, these companies can be subject to more stringent regulation. They could also be broken up. But they make the point that if this does happen, if they are broken up, then it would lead to a loss in innovation and the value of those companies. Do they have a point?
Yeah, no, I think the key point here, the key question is what problem are we actually trying to solve? And the whole debate gets confused very, very quickly. One of my colleagues here mentioned political speech. That is not a problem that antitrust is supposed to solve or can solve. That is a problem that legislation regarding political ads can solve, and we should pass legislation around political ads on internet platforms. Privacy, that's not a problem that antitrust should solve. That's a problem that privacy legislation should solve. When it comes to competition policy, the evidence is, I think, pretty clear that historically the U.S. has relied, at least for the last half century, on what's called the consumer welfare standard. Are consumers better off or worse off? And I don't think anybody can make an argument that consumers are being harmed by what these companies are doing in general. Now, I agree with the point, if there's actual anti-competitive conduct going on, that should be prosecuted, and that's current laws allow that to happen. But that's very different than saying, well, we should break up Facebook. I don't pay anything for Facebook or Google because they're free. I love Amazon Choice. I have an Apple phone. I'm super happy, and I think I'm typical of most consumers in this. I don't get what the point of what we're really trying to solve. the point really, I think, what's going on in the U.S. is that there's a whole set of folks, particularly on the progressive left, who are trying to change the standard for antitrust away from the consumer welfare standard or even the overall economic welfare standard to something much more narrow. And that's really around protecting workers or protecting other competitors. Historically, it didn't matter if you put your competitor out of business. That was seen as fair, as long as you did it fairly. And now we're asking questions of Jeff Bezos. Hey, you're competing to put a product on your website that might hurt another company. I mean, that's unprecedented. That's what you're supposed to do as a competitor. You're supposed to try to put your competitors out of business. That's the entire goal of a free market economy.
Adonis Hoffman, as I said, these companies are very big, they're very powerful, and they do have very powerful allies in Congress as well. Let's listen to one representative at those hearings and listen to what he had to say. Let's watch this.
I want to reiterate something I've said throughout this investigation. Being big is not inherently bad. Quite the opposite. In America, you should be rewarded for success.
That was Congressman James Sensenbrenner talking there, Adonis. But what do you make of the fact that he's saying that being big is not necessarily a bad thing?
Absolutely correct. There's nothing inherently wrong with being successful for having market dominance. But let's be clear about what Congress is really trying to do here. Congress has a much broader jurisdiction than just looking at antitrust enforcement. In fact, antitrust is left probably most appropriately to the Justice Department and maybe the Federal Trade Commission. So as Congress looks at the behavior of big tech, it is rightfully concerned about privacy. It's rightfully concerned about the implications that the company has, in addition to competition, restraint of trade, the practices that one of the previous speakers talked about, political bias, for example. That's well within the purview of a congressional overview and congressional oversight. With respect to antitrust law, antitrust law is all about balancing competing interests. We're looking at the marketplace and we're looking at the behavior of certain companies. And I would suggest that when we think about companies like Amazon, for example, and look at its market dominance, but look at what Amazon has done to third-party sellers, for example, in the marketplace. They've almost obliterated the capacity of some of these sellers to make an honest living because Amazon, through its own internal proprietary practices, incorporates a set of rules and regulations that set the standard. They're the market maker. And so it is perfectly allowable for Congress to look behind the broader marketplace implications, to look at some of the practices that a company like Amazon has engaged in. Same with Facebook with respect to its practice. So I think we have to look at this in context. It's not a pure antitrust scrutiny, right. And it's not purely for the just looking at the behavior, competitive behavior. We have to look at the entire set of practices that these companies are engaged in, how they impact consumers, what are the merits, what's the impact on small businesses, and other interests and rights that are squarely protected and within the purview of Congress to review.
Harry, before we move on to some of the other issues, I just want to get your response to what Robert told us a moment ago, that one of the problems here is defining what the problem is and how to fix it.
Well, I don't have so much of a problem on that. So one of the issues which Rob did mention was this idea of a consumer welfare standard. And this is a flag much fought over in antitrust today. But consumer welfare, as many people believe, not everyone, but as many people believe, does not just encompass the welfare of the end buyer, the last buyer. Firms, companies that are excluded from being able to compete have been always, from 1890, protected by the antitrust laws. Now, call them what you would like, but when you're talking about exclusionary behavior, when you're looking, for example, at the Microsoft litigation brought in 1998, This wasn't a question of what end user consumers were doing exactly, or even the price that they were paying. It was a question of quashing nascent upstart competitors, particularly the Netscape browser, which was a potential challenge to Microsoft's monopoly position, as Bill Gates foresaw. And the courts agreed that that was a violation of the antitrust laws. And part of the problem was not just their opportunity to compete, which is an important part of antitrust, but how that helps consumers and how the innovation that other competitors can bring helps consumers. So I would differ a bit from Rob's notion of consumer welfare, and I think the critique that many people have, this is not just a few in antitrust, is that consumer welfare as a slogan has been narrowed way too much, and that it can include the opportunity of small firms to compete, and the way in which these platforms affect their ability to do so.
Could I just respond to that quickly, to Harry's point?
Go ahead.
So, Harry, I more or less agree with you. I think in the Microsoft case, for example, it wasn't about that they were trying to compete with Netscape. It was about how they were competing with Netscape. That was the case. It was about exclusion, writing the code so it wasn't what they weren't able to get into the software to do it right. I 100% agree with that. But when Amazon decides, hey, people are buying batteries on this other seller, and so we're going to put batteries, seller-owned batteries, as long as they're doing that in an upfront way, that to me is not, there's not a problem with that. It's no different than when you go to a grocery store, a big grocery store like Safeway in the U.S., and you go to buy Safeway, I don't know, corned beef or something like that, and it's sold against somebody else's corned beef. Should Safeway not be allowed to do that? They're a platform. They're competing. So I think we're really on dangerous ground if we somehow say that every small little seller is sacred and cannot be competed against. It's really about how they're being competed against, and that to me is not an issue that the committee should be focused on. That's an issue that the FTC should be focused on, or the DOJ.
What sort of power does an Amazon have, for example, in placing its own products in the market? Does it have some sort of monopoly power there in that instance? Is it going to be able to, by virtue of its size and scale, essentially eclipse any kind of competition that a small or third-party seller could have, even though that party might still be on its platform? Right. Those are the inquiries that must be asked in this example.
Okay, Mark Niu, I want to move on to another big issue that was discussed at these hearings, and that is that companies like Facebook and Twitter have become very powerful political platforms. As you pointed out in your piece earlier, and Mark Zuckerberg was asked about Facebook promoting racism and disinformation. Do you think that they would accept some kind of regulation on that, or would any kind of regulation fall foul of the First Amendment?
I think that's going to be very difficult to regulate because whichever way you have it, one side is not going to be happy. Facebook actually stepped up on its own in June by announcing that it wasn't allowing hate speech in ads that targeted specific race or sexual orientation or ethnicity. And they also announced on their own that it will label content that it decides that violates those rules. For example, if you have a congressman that says something racist, they felt it could be deemed newsworthy, that people would actually want to look at it. So they actually were able to regulate themselves, but the pressure came after 100 brands were going to pull their ads, or actually pulled their ads from Facebook. So it was the market pressure that actually created the force for Facebook to act. So that seems like a way that could happen a lot more successfully when pressure is put on them to act, as opposed to Congress stepping in. As we could see, the political bias on both sides would have a difficult time formulating specific rules. So I think the most likely scenario is to pull them before them, question them, grill them, and come well armed with research to point out their failings in those areas and have it known that if they don't act properly, the market is going to react. Anand.
Harry, first, this looks like a minefield on how you regulate this kind of content on these platforms. How do you think they should move forward with that?
Well, so I'll give you what I think should be the antitrust response, and it may be a little different from what Rob said. We're not going to regulate and shouldn't and probably can't constitutionally regulate directly by the government as to what these platforms, what speech they can allow or not. So what we've seen to some extent is some market pressure. But the antitrust response is we are concerned about excessive power, in part for democratic reasons. And one way to deal with it is to not have excessive power, but to have competition. So a way to deal with that is to break up Facebook so that, if people wanted to go to a platform filled with hate speech, God bless them in a way. But there would be other platforms competing for advertising that did otherwise. And this I think really is the vision of antitrust, that competition provides benefits, not just lower price or even innovation to consumers, but social benefits from having deconcentration of power and diversity of views. So that's what I would do. Rob knows this. I would break Facebook up. We could have, as I've said before, face and book, and let them at it.
Robert, of course, this is a very robust debate that's taking place right now, what appears on Facebook and places like Twitter. Here's Representative Jim Jordan, a Republican, at the hearing. This is what he had to say.
We all think the free market's great. We think competition's great. We love the fact that these are American companies. But what's not great is censoring people, censoring conservatives, and trying to impact elections.
So how does that complicate the situation, Robert?
Well, I mean, first of all, again, let's come back to what's going on here. These are essentially network industries, and so if we broke up Facebook into face and book and maybe hand and leg, most Americans would end up being on all four platforms, and they'd have to post everything. There's a reason why Facebook, there's one real sort of social network platform. There's one Twitter, there's one LinkedIn. It's because nobody in their right mind wants to post 4 times. And so you get one platform. I think actually going in the direction of breaking them up would be really awful, frankly, for speech and discourse, because you'd have platforms that just attract really extremist views like 4chan would do. I mean, all the Nazis would go there. And at least now, when you have a big platform like Facebook or Twitter or whatever, they do a pretty good job of sort of keeping out the worst of the worst on those platforms and that everybody's on. If we break them up, consumer welfare is going to go way down, and we're just basically going to get more extremist sites. I mean, there's a site now, I don't want to call it extremist because it's not, but it's called Parler, and it's kind of trying to be the conservative alternative to Facebook. And more power to them, good for them. But do we really want a site where only conservatives are talking to only conservatives? I don't think that would be a good thing to happen. And lastly, to Facebook's point, I mean, I understand Representative Jordan's frustration. He's mad at Facebook, but so are the progressives. The progressives are demonizing Zuckerberg because he's putting too much on. So what's Facebook supposed to do? And the answer is they really can't win for losing here, because if they take down a little bit too much, the conservatives attack them for being thought police.
Right.
If they don't count enough, they attack them as being racists. There's really almost a no-win situation there. Yeah. Facebook is doing the best they can, as most of the other platforms are.
Adonis Hoffman, this seems to be such a unique problem because, if we look at the content on Facebook or Twitter, this is content generated by users, or members or subscribers, or call them what you will. And if we allow companies to have the power to choose what constitutes acceptable speech and what doesn't, isn't that a recipe for abuse?
Well, not necessarily. I believe that, first of all, let me just say that regulating content or restricting speech, I should say, is well beyond the First Amendment. With a few exceptions, the First Amendment is there to, and that's for governmental action, by the way, is there to allow for the free expression of ideas, no matter how reprehensible they may be to any individual. Again, with a few exceptions that have been indicted as a result of Supreme Court cases throughout the decades. In terms of private action, though, let's look at it. I mean, self-regulation in some instances works. In many instances, it does not. And that's where I think we see the market stepping in, hopefully stepping in, to address the reprehensible behavior. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong, illegal, or unethical about a company deciding what its own standards should be. I mean, that happens in media all throughout across the spectrum. Networks decide what can and go on. If they're over the air, they're certainly governed by FCC regulations. But if they're not, then they can decide what goes on their platform. And the same thing for these online platforms. I think the real issue turns to whether there is an outcry from the community, whether some of this is so patently offensive that it offends common notions of either decency or hate, what have you. That's where we get into problems, and I think that's where Jordan was coming down. With respect to political bias, I mean, you know, let's face it. There are lines being drawn across all media platforms. You've got those on the left and those on the right. If you watch cable television in the United States, you know that MSNBC has a point of view, as does Fox News. And so I think that we have to keep that market reality in place. Congress, again, going back to the notion, the role of Congress here, Congress has a much broader sweep than just looking at the narrow antitrust implications of the actions of these companies. They're governed essentially by the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. And so that's very broad. It has to do with the impact on commercial activity. And that's a very legitimate inquiry that they should go to. And Congress has at its disposal much broader tools to address these problems than regulatory agencies or even the DOJ.
Okay, Mark, I've just got a couple of minutes left. These hearings in Congress were the final hearings before that particular subcommittee produces a report. That report's expected sometime this month. What happens next?
Well, there's really no follow-up right now. They got to continue to put the pressure on with the election coming. So the next step hasn't really been announced. It's an ongoing process where they continue. So we got to see how they continue to regulate themselves during the election. They've taken a lot of, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg took a lot of heat. So it's up to kind of see whether they react to the pressure that's been put upon them.
Harry, very quickly, in the few seconds we have left, do you see legislation coming down the road?
Well, I think that's the whole purpose of these hearings. So I think Representative Cicilline is in the process of drafting something, obviously not for this Congress. There is legislation that has already been introduced, actually, in this Congress that would deal with some of these issues. I think this will carry over to the next Congress, depending on its composition, obviously, and the composition of the national administration. But this is not a problem to be solved instantly, although I must say, in response to Rob's inefficiency of posting on multiple platforms, there's an app for that. My daughter actually told me she uses an app that posts on multiple platforms. So things can work out. I think competition is to allow you to change the channel. If you don't like Facebook, there should be alternatives. If you don't like Amazon, there should be alternatives.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Niu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.